You are listening to Empire Museum with Joe Maynock. Britain has a selective amnesia about its past and prefers to brush many chapters under the historical carpet. Empire Museum audibly imagines an unsanitized appraisal of Britain's past and examines legacies still reverberating today. With us today, Empire Museum's first ever guest, the wonderful Stephen Welsh, who boasts a formidable career in the museum sector. He was project curator at the International Slavery Museum, Liverpool, and also curator of living cultures at Manchester Museum. He's shown a lifelong commitment to engaging with diaspora communities, countries of origin, and traditional owners in order to better understand the ongoing impact of colonialism and to support cultural revitalisation. Now in 2020, he's gone freelance to harness his experience for good and is a true advocate for an inclusive and more socially impactful museum sector. So I very much like to welcome you, Stephen, to the show. Thank you very much for coming on.
Hi, Joe. Yeah, thanks for that introduction. That was very flattering of you.
I want to make this conversation accessible to people that aren't necessarily dialed in to the ongoing debates which surround museums. And I think the best way to do that is to establish some context. So can I just start by asking you to contextualize the very idea of an encyclopedic museum, and what do people mean when discussing museums born of empire?
Good question, Joe. Well, encyclopedic museums, Victorian encyclopedic museums, are essentially a product of the British Empire. So in the late 19th century, Britain is at the height of its imperial power. And basically, the different people and the different parts of the world which Britain colonised, they acquired vast quantities of cultural heritage, ancestral human remains, and natural science, and brought them back to big towns and cities in the UK, and built these encyclopedic museums to house these collections, which were supposed to be comprehensive, so encyclopedic. So they were supposed to comprehensively represent all the different parts of the world which Britain had colonised.
I see. No, that's perfectly explained. And this is kind of talking about quite a specific time frame, I'd say roughly speaking, sort of from the 1890s to the 1930s, where it's pretty much clear as day that racism kind of took a grip on Western museums. So with that in mind, I'd just like you to try and explain, broadly speaking, the mental scaffolding of these institutions, the logic that they took as gospel, and what kind of ideas were guiding their decisions to kind of construct the collections they did.
Well, yeah, I mean, the sort of intellectual scaffolding that surrounded these institutions really consists of scientific racism, things like benevolent paternalism, and even hypermasculinity. So effectively, this is an elite white male view of the world, and it's a colonial racist view of the world. So they wanted to establish categories, taxonomies and typologies, hierarchies of culture. And of course, who did they put at the very top of that but themselves? So industrialized Western colonial imperial powers were at the top of these cultural hierarchies, and other people were planted below them. And therefore, through these collections, through these institutions, they acted as a way to justify colonial intervention, colonialism. So if they could prove that they were more sophisticated culturally, technologically, and otherwise, and the people whom they colonized were, as they would see it, inferior, then therefore they were doing something which was wonderfully benevolent by colonizing them. And so the collections really fit in to that philosophy in the late 19th century, early 20th century, which is one of white superiority, benevolent paternalism, a very elite white male view of the world.
Yeah, thank you very much. That makes perfect sense, and I think probably from there we can try and segue on to we're not discussing these contextual ideas in a vacuum, because some of the ideologies which you sketched out, such as this idea of benevolent paternalism, which I'll come back to in a moment, if you could touch on how these colonial legacies are still relevant today, because the museum, like many others, is kind of an institution. We just have to deal with these ongoing legacies of empire, and kind of link to this idea that perhaps decolonization is, very much an ongoing process. So, like, how to you are these kind of legacies which spring up from this very specific moment in time? How are they still reverberating in the world we live in today?
Well, having worked in museums for 15 years and encountered these histories of colonialism and enslavement, I mean, if you think about it, so I worked on a project which was a commemoration of the bicentenary of the abolishment of the British Slave Trade Act. So in 2007, to commemorate what happened in 1807. But 200 years isn't that long in terms of human history. So if you think about your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, it's not that far back in time.
Yeah.
So legislation can change and politics can change and society can change. But these really pernicious, bad ideas, that racist infrastructure that we just discussed, keeps going. It doesn't go anywhere. It morphs, it shifts, it changes. So it shouldn't surprise anybody that by the time we get to 2020, these racist ideas that fundamentally underpin Western society are still there, because marginalized groups have worked their hardest to try and confront and combat these ideas, but they haven't necessarily been supported by wider society and by successive governments to do that. So those ideas that were embedded during enslavement and colonialism, they hadn't really gone anywhere. They haven't gone anywhere. And of course, when we think about museums being the embodiment of colonialism, again, the question has to be, how hard have we worked to confront those ideas, draw attention to them, and then transform the museum appropriately? So it shouldn't, again, come as a surprise to anybody that museums which are a product of empire are full still with these ideas, as is society at large. And so I always try and think about it like that. You're only talking about several generations of your own family away in terms of human history, when people were enslaved and Britain was this huge colonial power. So the ideas, the philosophy that underpin that is embedded in all of our political structures, in our curriculum, etc. And we're going to have to do the hard work now together, collectively, to address it and change it.
Yeah, thank you. That's very eloquently put. And staying on that topic just for a moment, I think the idea of benevolence and benevolent paternalism, I think is the term that you used. Could you articulate on that slightly further as perhaps a specific example of the continuation of these ideologies and how that's kind of stayed kind of pertinent within dimensions of the museum industry now? Is that something that, what does that term mean, and what are the legacies of that?
Well, it's a colonial philosophy again. So benevolent, like the idea that we're doing good to someone or something or some place, and paternalism, of course, refers to this idea of being like a dominant force, like a father figure, essentially, would be a direct translation. So the idea that you're being this father figure which is doing good in the world, and so you're schooling children, or you're schooling people that are younger than you, or a family. So it really emerges, in the late 19th century, the idea that you colonize people for their own good. or you do things to other people for their own good, and in that way you can rationalize and justify enslavement and colonialism. And so that does seep through again, because when you say to people benevolence or benevolent, a lot of people won't necessarily see that as a problematic term. And in certain instances, it really isn't. But in terms of the history of colonialism and enslavement in the 19th century, early 20th century, it is massively problematic. And then, of course, it does manifest in different ways in the arts and culture sector and in museums. The idea, perhaps, that art and culture and heritage will do you good, it will repair you, it will mend you just by being exposed to it. So the idea that art, culture, and heritage is this quintessentially um, brilliant force for good, this phenomenon that will help people, it will alleviate poverty, it will combat racism, is really quite questionable. And we need to look carefully at that and where that philosophy is coming from and what connections does it have, historically or otherwise, with these philosophies that emerged in the late 19th, early 20th century around benevolent paternalism. So what we need to do is move away from that premise to something which is reciprocal, to something which is more democratic. So the way we experience art, heritage, and culture in a museum or in other places needs to be democratic. It can't be done in a way which is a benevolent institution or organization doing something for the greater good of that particular community, which they claim to have identified as being deficient or insufficient in terms of their relationship with art, heritage, and culture. So it grows, it connects in very different ways, in interesting ways. And again, what is happening, of course, is that these people are not necessarily intentionally doing this. People believe in some way that they're doing people good through the way they execute these different philosophies. But I think now, precisely as you said, in terms of this point in time, for so many different reasons, everything needs to be reevaluated. How we operate, what we do, why we do it, and what connections exist between ongoing philosophies around art, heritage, and culture and those philosophies and ways of thinking that emerged in the late 19th, early 20th century.
Absolutely, yeah, that's very important. And later on in the conversation, I want to delve into some of the specific aspects of, how the sector now can be democratic in its practices. But just before then, I'd like you to try and explain kind of what's going on in the museum sector now, because it's very much, just the kind of the premise of the conversation we're having now is obviously not come out of a vacuum, and it's been built on sort of decades of activism. But it appears to me that, in this moment of time, it's kind of, perhaps you could say, a bit of a cultural shift going on. It seems to be a very, relevant conversation. So I just wondered if you could try and kind of sum up what's changing in the museum sector, what are the contours of the debate going on, and also, as a kind of a second question, to what extent is this a novel advent of change of views, or to what extent is this kind of a cumulative effect of building on the works of activism?
Absolutely. I think it's a cumulative effect of marginalised communities, and particularly Black, Asian and ethnically diverse communities in the UK instance, having campaigned and fought for generations in terms of recognition, in terms of their contribution to culture and society in the United Kingdom, but a more clear and honest representation of what happened during the British Empire as well, to their ancestors, to their own families, and what is still happening in different parts of the world as a consequence of British colonialism. So it's a cumulative effect. And some museums have been doing brilliant work over the past several decades. And of course, one that springs immediately to mind is the International Slavery Museum, who has been committed to anti-racism, anti-colonial work really since its inception. Other museums have also contributed to that work along the way. But I can tell you from my own experience, having been a curator in both Liverpool and Manchester, that the change has come as a consequence of communities asking for that change and pressing for that change in terms of how their culture is represented or how they are included or not in the cultural provision of a city or a town or a neighbourhood. So I learned so much through engagement and co-creation, co-curation, co-production with communities in both Manchester and Liverpool. And with that came the transformation of the organisation. So without that, I think it's highly unlikely that many art galleries and museums make the shift that is now required. That can only be done seriously and sustainably with these marginalised communities who traditionally have not had access to the resources which museums can provide.
Yes, and I think the idea that change only comes about after it's been repeatedly asked for by activists is really important to underscore and acknowledge. I mean, it's not as if museums woke up one day and the kind of divine intervention felt a sudden irresistible impulse to enact all this positive change and to suddenly face up to the ongoing impact of colonialism. Rather, it would probably be more accurate to draw a kind of visual analogy with a dam, and this dam can kind of be seen as metaphorically representing the very structures of colonial and encyclopedic museums, which have basically been a bulwark against change. But this dam is basically holding back the proverbial rising storm waters, sort of metaphorically standing in there for the tireless works of activists over the decades. And I wouldn't say that we are seeing a unleashing of a wholesale torrent of change, because there is a lot that still needs to be done, but certainly now cracks are emerging in this dam, and cracks are seeping through because of the tireless accretion of activists kind of constantly knocking on the door of this proverbial dam, and it's seeping through, and we are seeing tangible change. And it is also another result as it kind of manages to seep through the dam and into the reservoir of mainstream thought, and it's kind of having a bit more of a wider cultural resonance. But I do want to get on to this problem of what museums can do to enact positive change in the modern world. It's clear now prerequisite to this is engagement with activists. But if you could expand on what curators can do to enact positive change, perhaps through the prism of your time at the International Slavery Museum. Was that an example of co-creation, and what went on there?
Well, of course, that was Gordon Bennett. What we're talking about now, almost, well, just over 10 years ago now, 15 years ago or so. And I think it's fair to say it wasn't necessarily the world's best example of co-curation. I mean, it did have elements of that, but you're talking about a project that happened 15 years ago. So in its own right, it was really forging ahead with links within Liverpool's black community, but also the wider African diaspora in parts of North America, the Caribbean, and West Africa itself. So now if we look at the museum sector, there are brilliant examples of quite intensive co-creation and co-production. But of course, you're talking about the early 2000s, and that wasn't as big a thing as it is actually now. But what they did back then was really quite exemplary, working with members of Liverpool's black community to introduce their biographies and family histories, to unearth some of the history of Liverpool's black communities, which very many people didn't know about, but also to try and reach out internationally to get a variety of narratives beyond those of the curator. So in that respect, it was groundbreaking in a lot of ways. And of course, it came into being because it was the bicentenary of the British abolishment of the Slave Trade Act. So there was a government emphasis on commemorating this, but it was also down to the hard work of Liverpool's black community that not only fought for what was the incarnation of the museum previously, which was the Transatlantic Slavery Gallery, which was one gallery within what is the Merseyside Maritime Museum, but it was black leaders, the black community in Liverpool that pushed and pressed for the museum to come into existence. A gallery wasn't sufficient enough by any stretch of the imagination. So they kept up the pressure and activism, and they worked closely with National Museums Liverpool, and then everything converged. So the funding from the government, the resources from National Museums Liverpool, but very much the activism of Liverpool's own black community that got this project up off the ground.
So co-curation and cooperation with activists, clearly two core means with which the museum can enact positive social change in the 21st century. Another way of doing so, repatriation. Repatriation is an issue that garners a lot of attention, a lot of media attention, an issue with which wider debates within the museum sector are often waged upon. But it's something that I'm interested in chatting to you about because you've had direct experience with repatriation, with the unconditional return of items from the Manchester Museum to Aboriginal Australians. So if you could just expand upon, or first of all, explain what is repatriation and then embellish upon your direct experience with repatriation.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, repatriation is a vital part of any contemporary work within a museum. And it really is in recognition of the activism of Indigenous peoples around the world who had, not just Indigenous peoples, of course, any part of the world, any culture or people whom had been colonised by the British and had their cultural heritage, ancestral human remains, and natural science removed without express permission. So they had no control, of course, because Britain was the colonial power. And Britain could effectively not only remove the assets of that community and that place, the so-called commodities, but it could also remove all these other things which we see in museums today. So that is highly problematic for obvious reasons. But we've got to recognise that when this was happening, communities resisted that. They did their best to prevent their cultural heritage, their natural science, and their ancestral human remains from being removed. So this isn't us. This isn't me projecting what could be described as political correctness onto the 19th and early 20th century. And even further back, I mean, in the instance of Australia, of course, First Nations Australians, since Cook arrived 250 years ago, resisted the removal of their cultural heritage, of their ancestors, of their natural history and science. They resisted these things. So they have fought for the return and the removal of these things for generations. And so now, after all of their hard work and their activism and their research and their determination, very many museums are engaging with this now, as they should have done probably decades ago. And so now what we're witnessing is an understanding of the need to reunify these communities and cultures and countries with their cultural heritage. And that's a really important point, because as they exist, as they exist in museums in the UK, they are incomplete. They're incomplete. They need to be reunified with their community, with their culture, or with their country, because they only tell a small part of the story as they exist in a museum. And so returning them, as we did in Manchester, the 43 secret, sacred, and ceremonial objects to um, Australian First Nations communities, they reactivated them. So those objects didn't go back to another museum in Australia, they went back to the communities who reactivated them and placed them back at the heart of their culture and community to revitalize it and reactivate these objects and use these cultural heritage items as they were always intended to be before they were taken and deposited in a museum where they were only either displayed or stored.
Yes, and I think with the repatriation debate, it's very much about what stands to be gained, not what stands to be lost. And yes, the very powerful image of the revitalization of items long held dormant, trapped behind glass, collecting dust, or oftentimes not even on display. And for a museum, it poses a unique opportunity to learn more about the collection itself, because it seems to me that only traditional custodians have the ability and knowledge to properly contextualize many of the items which are in these displays, because they have the kind of historical knowledge from being part of the culture, part of the oral tradition. But yeah, engaging with this debate for museums, it's far from the neglect, the omission, the whitewashing with the history of imperialism. It's actually actively engaging with it. And I think engagement with it would force museums to be more creative, more self-reflective about their narratives of empire. But at the same time, repatriation is controversial. It does garner debate. And there's institutions such as the Victoria and Albert and the British Museum in London, which generate a lot of animosity because they've got these very much contested items that have been continually called for repatriation by successive governments and activists over the years. The Benin bronzes is a key example. And oftentimes when you ask these institutions, such as the British Museum, can we have our stolen objects back? The retort is, well, no, but we may consider the possibility of a long-term loan or a form of loan, but we're not prepared to give them back to you unconditionally. So what do you think about this logic of only being able to loan stolen goods, and how does that speak to wider power dynamics at large?
No, that's a good question, Joe. And yeah, some museums don't feel particularly confident about repatriation. And so you raise an important issue that although museums as a whole in the West are engaging with repatriation more so than they ever have done, I think it's doubtful that the vast majority of them will feel confident enough or move to a position where we'll see unconditional repatriation from their collections. So another approach, as you've described, is to suggest or recommend a long-term loan to the country or community of origin. And one of the reasons for that, of course, which is described, is that the sort of legal restrictions that bind certain museums from being able to pursue full repatriation, unconditional repatriation. Yeah, I think we need to find a solution to that. I think that is clear. I think we don't want to see a continuation of any form of benevolent paternalism where a museum or another country thinks it knows what is precisely best for cultural heritage items that originated from another part of the world. We need to broaden our understanding of how material culture is cared for and looked after in different parts of the world, in different communities and cultures. We in the West have a lot to learn about this. We really do. And of course, when these cultural heritage items have been in the possession of Western museums, undoubtedly the people who over generations have taken care of them have done the best to do that with the resources and perhaps the limited knowledge that they had at their disposal to be able to do that. But now we know so much more. We know so much more. We can do this work confidently in so many different ways that it really doesn't stand up to scrutiny to continually put barriers in the way of repatriation. So we need to work on this proactively and positively and in collaboration. And we need to realise and reflect that UK museums have lots to learn from how to care for collections and material culture and cultural heritage items. And we don't have all the answers, and we certainly haven't done everything impeccably during the time that these things have been with us. And added to that, the way in which these things were taken in the most abominable circumstances, some very obvious episodes of horrific military violence, as is the case with the Benin Bronzes, and in other instances, of course, more subtle examples of colonial brutality where a single community might have a sacred object taken away from them, and as a consequence of that action, they internalize the violence because, of course, they are oppressed by the colonial power, and they have no means at their disposal to take out that frustration and anxiety on the colonial power. So, given the way in which these things were taken, and given the fact that we know so much more, and we need to be humbled and realise again that we don't know always what's best for particular cultural heritage items. We've got lots to learn from that. So given that, show a bit of humility. We need to move, and some of the bigger museums need to move to a position where things are being reunified with the culture, country or community from which they came. Because as I said before, the way in which they are in our museums, they are absolutely incomplete. They're not being used in the way they should be. They've been taken from communities, buildings, archaeological sites. They've been decontextualized. And we can do wonderful things with the modern technology at our disposal to try and recontextualize them. But we need to realize that through benevolent paternalism and all the other colonial modes of behavior allowed us to extract these things. And now is the time that they have to be returned home.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. And in terms of kind of explaining some of the stagnation from certain museums in the country, it kind of boils down to, it seems to be direct legacies of that benevolent paternalism idea. The notion that countries of origin have to kind of replicate Western conditions of care to be judged kind of worthy of being able to receive their items back home. Also the idea of a kind of so-called race to the bottom, in which a slippery slope which results in a museum's collection being entirely wiped out, which is kind of the logic that I've to kind of defend against repatriation. In addition to the ideological one, you touched on this before with your mention of legal restrictions, but very much with some of the bigger ones, it seems to be that museums are lamenting inaction because of these institutional constraints which effectively don't allow repatriation in its true form. For example, the V&A is basically, they've got a policy which prohibits trustees from accessioning objects unless they're found to be replicas or damaged. So that's why they turn to loans. So I suppose two questions kind of coming from that. Do you think that this kind of institutional baggage and paralysis is something that can be overcome? And to what extent does this kind of contrast with your experience as a curator? Because your time at Manchester, it was seemingly so that you had a lot more kind of freedom to exercise your own agency and to kind of implement your ideas of what socially conscious curatorial practices actually means. But you didn't have maybe some of the constraints and baggage which institutions like the British Museum have.
I think, yeah, that's a really good question, Joe. And different museums are governed in different ways, and so you have local government museums, you have national museums, which are funded directly by the government, central government. You have university museums like Manchester Museum, and again, they're part of the University of Manchester. So if we take university museums, for instance, of course, and Manchester Museum in particular, over the past several decades, Manchester Museum has really been at the forefront of repatriation work, but also being socially responsible as a museum. So developing relationships with communities across the city, across the region, but also across the world, and particularly with those communities that have a deep connection with their collections. So, of course, I worked there for 13 years, but I benefited directly as a consequence of the activism of Manchester's communities, of the Black, Asian and ethnically diverse communities, of Maori communities in New Zealand and Aboriginal communities in Australia. So when I arrived, there was this great wealth of action that had already happened to return ancestral human remains, to build strong bonds with diverse communities across the city. And also being part of a university which is socially responsible and realises that it has obligations, not just to the city, but to the wider world. So all of these things converge. And of course, my passion and my experience at the International Slavery Museum. So, but also my background as a working class person, and realising that, of course, any museum needs to represent the society which it serves, and it needs to be responsible to all those different communities. So if a certain community or a certain group isn't engaging with a public museum, why isn't it? And how do we change that? How do we resolve it? So being part of Manchester Museum, all of its wonderful history, all of its wonderful relationships, really allowed us to reach a position where we could pursue the unconditional repatriation because of the work that had happened by previous curators, previous communities, and the support and the conviction of the university to be able for us to do this work. Now, as you say, like other museums, the V&A, the British Museum, various legislation which is in place, which they struggle with, and which so-called prevents them from committing to repatriation. This is the really important fundamental point with everything that's happened over the past several months that's been brought into acute focus in terms of racism, discrimination, oppression. Now, we need systemic change. And so if there are systems in place which support a colonial way of thinking, a discriminatory way of thinking, now is the time to address them and dismantle them. So I don't think it's going to stand up to scrutiny any longer for any one museum anywhere to say, I'm very sorry, due to our funding and governance structures or our concerns about depleting the collection, we are not prepared to engage with this work. I don't think that will be acceptable to their visitors, to their audiences, who will also expect them to behave responsibly and to tackle systemic injustices. And part of those systemic injustices are what we're discussing, which is how are you governed? Who are your trustees? Who is on your committee? Is it representative of the communities you serve or wider society? Why does this legislation exist? Who put it in place? Why did they put it in place? When did they put it in place? And what do we need to do now to change that? Because we know fundamentally it is the ethical and appropriate thing to do to ensure cultural heritage items and other things in museums which were taken as a consequence of colonial abuses need to be sent home. So it's about that desperate need for systemic change. And this will really show, I think, what the museum sector is about and what it's up for. So we need to see that conviction, those expressions of solidarity with oppressed groups and communities. That's brilliant. Now that needs to convert into action. And part of that action has to be systemic change within the museum. And so if there are barriers in place that exclude certain groups or certain ways of working, we really need now to address them and to change them if they're not having a positive or a progressive effect. Now is the time to do it.
Yes, I very much agree. And the idea that a museum should be a site, an agent of social change, rather than merely a passive institution, is an idea that I find very convincing indeed. And the possibilities which stand to be gained from all this look very attractive. But I was just wondering what you make of this idea of conversation over action. And now these issues we've been discussing are gaining currency and kind of cultural potency. Do you think there's a danger of kind of slipping into over intellectualization, abstract thought, and kind of getting bogged down in rhetoric? Or are you more hopeful? Does it to you constitute a marked turning point, especially in the wake of Black Lives Matter? Or are you more skeptical, more cautious? One of the key reasons why I wanted to be able to chat to you at length, Stephen, is that your curatorial CV is largely predicated on tangible examples of change. But I'm just wondering, are you hopeful that this change is coming, or are you more cautious?
Probably a bit of both, Joe, to be honest. So it was wonderful, like I said, really empowering, really encouraging over the past several months to see these pledges of solidarity, which we'd never seen before from the sector as a whole. A real commitment, a real conviction and authenticity behind it to tackle racism, to tackle these colonial legacies, to express solidarity with groups who have been historically and contemporarily oppressed. So that was really empowering. But you're quite right. Like, how now are they going to convert that into action? How are we going to see the systemic change that is needed, the organizational change? And so this isn't about putting an exhibition on, and this isn't about putting a few tweets on or a Twitter thread. And I mean, they're all brilliant things and people can connect with them. But if the real hard systemic change doesn't happen, we're going to be back at square one. And this goes, like I said earlier, like, who are your trustees? Who's on your committee? Who are your curators? How diverse is your curatorial team? How diverse is the museum as a whole? Is it representative of your city, your neighbourhood, society at large? How do you recruit people? How do you care for collections? How do you conserve collections? All of these things now, there needs to be a sort of forensic analysis of them, because all of these things in one way or another are contributing to the lack of diversity within the museum sector. And a good example of this is that, of course, we've had austerity, and now we've had COVID. And so Black, Asian, and ethnically diverse communities and working class communities have been impacted on this adversely more than any other communities. So recent reports that came out around working class inclusion in the arts and culture sector, in the creative industries at large, said that in about 2014, inclusion and representation of working class people in positions within the creative industries had basically stopped. It had flatlined. And so we go from 2014 to 2020, and there's been no change. No change. So what we're seeing is a few sort of entry-level posts funded by different funding organisations to try and increase that representation, but it is a drop in the ocean. And the same goes for Black, Asian, and ethnically diverse people. They're not represented at the level that they should be in these organisations. So this is a long-term issue, and austerity, COVID has impacted on that. And then, of course, what we've seen recently as a consequence of various marginalised groups expressing their frustration and their concern about the situation that has been going on for decades and generations, and then museums pledging solidarity to support and change. Yeah, we really need to see this, and it's been a long time in the coming, and it's great to see people pledging commitment and solidarity, but that really does need to translate into action now, because the consequences of not showing that and having no commitment or conviction to that systemic change, which is so desperately needed, there will be generations of marginalised groups and communities that will develop no relationship whatsoever with museums. And that is a huge threat, not only to the existence of these museums, but also to how these marginalised groups access art, culture, and heritage. It will have a direct impact on them. So without the action, the outcomes don't look necessarily good. But I do have hope. I do genuinely believe that museums have changed in the past as a consequence of external pressure brought to bear on them. And I think they'll do it again. I think they'll change. I think there's brilliant work happening with some funders. And so the funders are determined to be more representative. The funders over the past several years, groups like the National Heritage Lottery Fund has really put money in place to increase representation and diversity. So with the funders doing it, there's another incentive and pressure brought to bear on the museum to change. So not only are the community groups pressing for it, at the other end as well, you've got the funders that are also requiring the museum to do it. And then you've got some really, truly wonderful and brilliant and committed people in museums that want to see that change and make it happen. And if you get the community group, those individuals and those teams and the funders together and they converge, the results will be brilliant. Alternatively, of course, if there is no follow through, if there is no systemic change, again, any relationship at all that has been built up with these communities over the past couple of decades could disappear overnight. And that would be understandable, because people would think, on the one hand, you're saying you're going to change it. On the one hand, you're saying that you're committed to supporting my community. And then on the other, nothing is materializing. How do we see this represented? How do we see it embodied? Where is it manifest? And they can't see it, and they're not included. So, yeah, I think we've reached a critical point, but I am really hopeful that brilliant groups of people, communities, professionals within the sector, funders, have the ability and the conviction to make that necessary change.
Yes, and I think I do share your tinge of hope that in the end museums will be responsive, and that there exists within the sector the necessary drive and dynamism to push change through, of course coupled with the continued cooperation with activists. But do also appreciate your words of warning at exactly what the stakes of this are. That being that if the pledges of solidarity which were made by museums in the wake of Black Lives Matter go unheeded, then the potential result of that would be the disillusionment of underrepresented groups that were promised the allure of change and that subsequently denied it, and that denial would be the catalyst of a fundamental disillusionment. So the stakes are very high. But to segue on somewhat, I mean, all this talk of systemic change, questioning colonial origins, telling repressed and invisible histories, repatriation, do the amalgamation of all these ideas and concepts represent your idea of decolonization? Are these concrete examples of the term being implemented in reality? And also, in terms of social inclusivity of the museum sector, can this be linked into decolonization? And to what extent does your status as a gay working class curator impact the way that you see the importance of social inclusivity in the museum sector?
Yeah, well, I think, again, decolonization, it really has to be systemic, Joe. So it has to be how a museum operates, how it's governed, all of these things that we've discussed. So it is about repatriating objects. It's about returning them home to their communities and to their countries of origin, reunifying them with those people and those places. But it's also about systemic change, all of those different things. What is currently happening in museums, which prevents them from being as inclusive as they possibly can be, and addressing them and dismantling them. So that sort of intellectual scaffolding that we talked about back in the 19th and 20th century, is that still in place? If it's still in place, let's be honest about it. And if you're not entirely sure about how to dismantle it, go out and ask and work with those people who are best placed to help you spot it and help you dismantle it. And invariably, those people will come from communities which have been historically and contemporarily oppressed through racism, colonialism, classism, ableism, homophobia, all of these different things in society which exclude and oppress people. So what needs to happen is you need to identify that colonial intellectual scaffolding, which in a lot of instances is still in place. It's still there. So it's embedded in the collection. It's embedded in the architecture. It's embedded in the curatorial disciplines. The rationale behind why different types of material culture from different time periods in different parts of the world are grouped and categorized in certain ways for various curatorial disciplines. So the existence, of course, of sort of a curator of anthropology as opposed to a curator of archaeology. The curator of archaeology might look after just Greek and Roman archaeology, whereas the curator of anthropology may look after contemporary cultural heritage from different parts of the world, mostly taken as a consequence of British colonialism. So all these different structures that exist, all these different functions in a museum, if they are connected, which invariably they are if you're a 19th century museum, with colonialism, they need to be identified and they need to be dismantled. And that can't happen internally. So museums are not necessarily self-correcting institutions. They change as a consequence of society demanding that change and communities taking action tirelessly, as I said, in the case in Liverpool, with Liverpool's black community, to get that transatlantic slavery gallery in place, and then to get the museum, the International Slavery Museum, to become a reality. Or whether it's in Manchester with the secret, sacred and ceremonial objects that we returned to Australia's First Nations peoples. That was 250 years of activism on behalf of those Indigenous communities. First, to prevent the removal of their ancestors and cultural heritage items. And secondly, to campaign tirelessly to have them returned once they'd been taken away from them. So we need the systemic change, we need the organisational change, but that can only be done in partnership, in close collaboration, in reciprocal engagement with these groups that have been on the receiving end of those discriminatory practices and colonial intellectual scaffolding, as you put it, Joe. So that's what it's a wholesale systemic change, which is also going to involve deeper, stronger partnerships and collaborations through co-curation, through governance than we've ever had before. And it may result in really obvious actions that capture people's imagination, like unconditional repatriation. Changing the way museums look internally is absolutely vital to that. So they need to be representative of society as a whole. And that shouldn't be a sort of spectacular demand. I mean, I cannot quite believe that we're in 2020 and there are still public organisations, whether it's museums or libraries or archives, that receive public funding but are not representative. They don't look like Britain in the 21st century. And the reason why that's vital, of course, is because we need different perspectives. We need different lived experiences to come into an organisation and change it. So it really isn't any good, to be blunt, having an organisation which is 99% white, hoping to do anti-racist work. So you need to change that, albeit that responsibility should not fall squarely on the shoulders of Black, Asian and minority ethnic members of staff. But if you're not representative of society and you're getting public money, like there are serious questions that need to be asked about that. Like, why in 2020 are these brilliant organisations that are receiving vast quantities of public funding wholly unrepresentative of the communities that they claim to be serving? So there's big questions there. And without that diversity, without that equability of representation, you can't do it, because you're always going to contract that work out to somebody else. You're always going to contract it out to another community or a consultant. You need to make that change internally. And as a socially responsible organisation in receipt of public funding, you really need to be representative of Britain in the 21st century. Otherwise, you're just like a Victorian encyclopedic time capsule. It's not going to help anybody, and we need to do better than that. We need to be better than that. And it's like I said, like reports that come out and say that in 2014, working class inclusion just stopped. We should not be in that situation. So now is the time to really change that. And for me, yeah, I mean, all of the things that we've discussed, like working class man from a northern town who's also gay and brought up in a town like in Skelmersdale, like we didn't have a museum or an art gallery, had a very good swimming pool, a brilliant library and a shopping centre. That's what we had. So culture was always something that was to be found in another place, in a bigger city. It was this rarefied thing. You don't quite understand what it is. You don't really think twice about museums and why they're there and what their purpose are. So there are still lots of people whose lives remain untouched by museums. And my life was transformed by them. So I can see the value in that. I can see the positive impact that they can have. So now is the time, again, to work harder to reach those communities who still remain untouched by these organisations, by arts, culture and heritage, because it can have a really positive impact on people's lives and it can change them. But for me, that's where I'm always coming from. I think about my own upbringing. I think about my own neighbourhood and community, my own experiences, and the limits that some people have in terms of engaging directly with a museum. And can we change that now? Can everything that's happened, COVID and austerity, can we find inventive, innovative ways to make sure that we can connect with more of those communities that are traditionally disadvantaged than we have ever done before. But again, the only way we're going to do that is that if we have museums in terms of their staff body, which are wholly representative of, again, the communities that they're working with. So we need that to happen, that sort of colonial, imperialist, intellectual scaffolding needs to be identified. It needs to be deconstructed. The museum needs to be representative in terms of its staff body of wider society. And that will come as a consequence of the systemic change as well, because you'll make it a place which is comfortable for people who have otherwise felt wholly uncomfortable in these workplaces. And then, yeah, from my own perspective, I'm really positive about it. And I think more people than ever from backgrounds like mine now have the opportunity to share their experiences and to share their passion for making sure that the change that was ongoing over the past couple of decades and now seems to have stalled, that we get it back on track. And all those pledges of solidarity to various communities over the past several months, now is the time to convert that into action. And if we can do that, the change is going to be phenomenal. The change will be absolutely spectacular. And the impact that it will have on people's lives will be phenomenal. But now is the time not to sort of think, oh, we're going to come out of lockdown and there's a vaccine, there's a vaccination on the way, so we can get back to normal, or it's a new normal. No, we don't need anything like a new normal. Please, no. Like, we need transformation now, and we need commitment to systemic change. And I think they can do it. And I think, like I said, like, let's get all these brilliant people and groups together that are committed to this, and let's do something fantastic, and let's do something which is representative of Britain in the 21st century. Let's make museums representative and relevant, and we can't miss the opportunity now to do that.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, very, very well put, and also like inspirationally put as well. Like, a sort of listening to you then, kind of pumped full of enthusiasm and hope, and because it really is about, you know, what stands to be gained from analysing these systemic problems and making the sector more socially inclusive. Like, some really seems like it would lead some positive things, and expertly put there with a lot of gusto, and kind of got me pumped up there at the end, which is a good note to finish on, because I don't want to keep you too long, but thank you very much for coming on the show. You've given some wonderful responses there, and hopefully you've captured the imagination of some people, and you've broadened horizons of people's perception of what's happening in museums now and what needs to be done. So thank you very, very much, Stephen. And also, might I add, congratulations on going freelance, and sort of good luck with wherever that takes you. I'm sure it'll lead to positive places, and I think your kind of closing summary of what you think stands to be done, what needs to be done. I hope that you can use your experience and all your knowledge to kind of enact some of that change which you sketched out there. So yeah, good luck with that, and thank you very much for coming on the show.
Brilliant. Pleasure, Joe. Thanks for inviting me. Yeah, and good luck with your future episodes.
Thank you very much.